Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm James Miller. This is the 8th installation of the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts Nature Connects, the webinar series we created to connect you with TNC staff and partners locally and around the globe, talk about some really incredible conservation topics. We've covered a lot of ground so far in recent weeks. We've traveled virtually to Africa and the Asia Pacific region. We don't have to go that far, though, to get a look at some surprising and beautiful wild spaces, as today's guest, Tom Rogers, will attest. A wildlife biologist and associate director of philanthropy with the Nature Conservancy's Vermont program, Tom is a connoisseur of New England's natural beauty and wildlife. Today, he's going to help us immerse ourselves in sights, sounds, stories that shape our region's season. Sorry. A little R&R for the soul, we hope. This virtual journey in nature celebrates birds, moose, frogs, mountains, and waterfalls that characterize our outdoor experiences. We may not be able to have quite the outdoor access that we would like these days, and we're fortunate to have Tom as our guide today. I for one, am very excited to spend some time with him. Tom has a biology degree from Colby College in Maine. He has a Master of Science in Wildlife Biology from the University of Montana, where his research focused on grizzly bears and other large carnivores. Tom lives in Stowe, Vermont with his wife and 2 daughters. He's worked in conservation for his entire career, but is relatively new to the Nature Conservancy, having joined us a little less than a year ago. Tom enjoys spending, well, he enjoys all the time he spends outdoors, but he particularly loves photography and bird watching and relishes the opportunity to combine those 2 things. And I suspect we're going to see a little bit of that in his presentation. Before I hand off the webinar to Tom, I just want to give a couple of housekeeping notes. Webinar attendees are muted. Tom's going to present for about 30 minutes. And after that, we'll take your questions. Please share your questions in the Q&A box on your screen. To get the best possible view of the presentation, we recommend that you go to a pull-down menu at the top center of the screen and choose Fit to Window. If you do have any technical problems, please reach out to us via the chat function, and we'll do everything we can to help. I think that's about it for the notes. And again, thanks everyone so much for being here today. I hope you enjoy the journey, and here's Tom.
All right. Well, thank you so much, James. Thank you, everybody, for being here on this hopefully brilliant, beautiful, sunny day that you're all experiencing the rest of New England like we are up here in Stowe, Vermont. So I just wanted to talk a little bit today about some of the wildness that we have in Vermont. You know, I've given similar presentations to this before, or in New England, sorry. I've given similar presentations to this before, and I really like to start it with that idea of wildness. It comes from that quote from Thoreau that in wildness is the preservation of the world. Sometimes people misquote it as wilderness, but it's really all about wildness. And you know, wilderness is like these big, vast expanses of nature, whereas wildness can be something that's right all around us all the time. And I think we have a lot of both of those in New England. We have both wilderness and we have wildness. So we've got these places that are, you know, vast expanses where you can still get out and just completely immerse yourself in nature. And they're wonderful. And I'm so glad that we have them, and they're incredible. And we have them really all over New England. So as James mentioned, I've spent some time in various parts of New England. I went to college in Maine. I've spent a lot of time in New Hampshire in the mountains, hiking in the presidentials, been to conferences on coastal Rhode Island, which is just beautiful. Eastern Massachusetts, I was working a little bit on a bear study, and I've run some whitewater in that area. So Even though I live in Vermont and most of my photography comes from Vermont, practically any one of these photos in this presentation could come from any one of our states here in New England. I think one of the things that people have to realize during this pandemic is how deep and important our connection with nature is. People have really been turning to the beauty of nature to find solace and comfort. You know, we realize how crucial it is to our mental health. And there's a lot of information, a lot of science that's coming out, some of it actually done by some of our scientists here at the Nature Conservancy on that connection between mental and physical health and that connection of nature. Literally, even just looking at a photograph like this of a pretty waterfall will do things like lower your heart rate, lower your blood pressure, you know, improve your mental health. So that's really why I kind of wanted to present this today, do a little bit of tour of our wonderful region of the country and talk a little bit about it. And I want this to be just a celebration of nature. So I know I've attended actually, James, a lot of the presentations that you guys have hosted and that we've hosted, and a lot of them are really diving down deep into kind of the science and the conservation. And I love that stuff. You know, as someone with a background in science myself, I really enjoy that. But today, I just want to put that all aside and just celebrate nature and how much we all love it and enjoy it. I want to go through the seasons that we have here in New England, and not the made up seasons, mud season and late winter and second winter and false winter and all those things, but just the real 4 seasons, and kind of talk about why I love the wildness of this part of the country. And I want to start very close to home for me. So as James mentioned, I live in Stowe, Vermont, and this trailhead is literally 4 minutes from my house. You know, earlier in the winter, I just ran up here real quick right before sunset as dinner was being made ready. I just needed to get out for a little bit. And I just love the fact that here in New England, we have places like this that are just minutes away from our homes. I'm sure many of you have similar views, just minutes from your door also, that you just love and that are so special to you. New England is the place that I think other people dream about living. And I think we're incredibly lucky to be here. And one of my favorite parts of being out in nature is seeing wildlife. So let's start with the wildlife that you're actually least likely to see now that we're in the winter season, which is bears, right? Obviously, bears are going to be spending most of the winter in their dens. And as James mentioned, in a previous life, I worked on bears. I did my master's degree on bears out west. And then after I moved back east, I actually worked on black bears for a little while also. So one of the fun parts of that is that when on this study, we were radio collaring bears. And when you go in the wintertime, when the bears are in their den, to check on the radio collar to make sure it's fit properly and it's working well, you tranquilize the female very briefly. And then you need to take the cubs out because otherwise the mother might roll over on top of them and could harm them. And so we take the cubs out, but the cubs have really no natural warmth. They need to stay against their mother for their warmth. And so in this case, the fun part of this is that you actually have to, as the researcher, keep them warm. So you have to stuff them right down inside your jacket. And because they're in the middle of their hibernation season, these cubs are so sleepy, but they're totally trusting. They're willing to cuddle with whoever will keep them warm. So I love this series of photos of this little guy yawning and then nestling right in. And I know the sound is off on all the people there, but I'm pretty sure I heard everybody just say, "Aw," because I love that. It is so cute. So fun cuddling these guys. Although I will say they are a little bit stinky and they do scratch you a little bit with their claws as they're trying to kind of hold on to you. So it's not all as magical as you might think. So this little bear, he's trying to look really intimidating, but this is just kind of a little guy. He's only about probably 85 pounds or so. I wouldn't want to be stuck in an elevator with him, but you know, he's really doing his best to make himself look big. But this is actually just a little bear here, as opposed to that one that we started the slide deck with. This is a huge male bear, probably weighing more than 300 pounds. And this is the type of bear that you could really find in any of the forested areas that we have in New England. These are the ones, these big males are going to go into the dens latest every winter, and they're probably going to come out earliest. Whereas the sows, the mothers, will go into the den first thing because they're going to have their babies inside the den and start nursing them over the winter. And so they'll be in the den all winter long regardless. The types of places that they're looking for inside their dens are places like this. Oftentimes we find bears on steep north-facing slopes. And the reason for that is because these are the slopes that are going to retain snow the longest and have the most snow. And what that snow does is it actually insulates the bear inside their den. It almost shuts the door to their den from all the really cold winter temperatures and winds and things like that. So snowpack, that stability of the snowpack in the wintertime is really an important part of maintaining good den sites for bears. A few of the mammals that you're going to see actually out and about running around in the winter, we all know, those of us with bird feeders know that red squirrels are going to be out and about sometimes. They spend a lot more time nestled up kind of in torpor during the winter time, but they'll come out on bright sunny days, and you can find most of the red squirrels in New England underneath my bird feeder at any given time, I'm pretty sure, in the winter time. Another animal that you see a little bit less of in the winter time, but they're still out and about and being cute, are these little chipmunks. But some of my favorite wintertime visitors are the birds. A few birds, like grosbeak, actually migrate into New England during the wintertime, into sunny tropical New England from places farther north. And so anytime I present a bird during this, I always like to give the sound just so you can hear what it sounds like as well. So here's a pine grosbeak for you. So kind of a little bit of a random up and down sound for that. And everybody's favorite visitor in the wintertime are these chickadees. So much fun watching groups of chickadees. The chickadees out back of our house are practically tame. I think my daughters consider them pets because when we go out to fill the feeder, they'll fly right around our heads. And the second we're done filling it, they dash right down and try to grab seeds first. So there's the cheeseburger sound of a chickadee. And they're just so fun. I love chickadees. They're just a hoot to watch, and I'm glad that they are with us year round. And you can just find them pretty much anywhere. One of the birds that people don't necessarily associate with winter are these guys here, bald eagles. These are some of the earliest nesters that we have here in Vermont. They lay some of the biggest eggs, obviously, and are going to have some of the biggest chicks, and so they have to start early. So they don't tend to go very far. Some eagles might stick around actually all wintertime if there's open water where they can continue to fish, but a lot of them will migrate a little bit further south of New England and then come back pretty early. Some will start nesting as early as January or February. So there's that eagle call. And just to set something straight, I like to always include this in every one of my presentations. This is what Hollywood considers an eagle call, and it is not an eagle call. So this is every time you see an eagle in a movie or TV show or in the Colbert Report at the opening sequence, this is the sound. So that is not an eagle. That is a red-tailed hawk right there. So let's set the record straight today, not an eagle. So one of the best adapted species to a northern New England winter are these guys. This is a really cool video that was taken up in the Mohegan Basin in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, and this is actually a Canada lynx. So this is something that y'all up in Maine are very lucky to have quite a few of. Over in New Hampshire and Vermont, we don't have nearly as many of these, although one of these was spotted actually right down in far southern Vermont a couple of years ago, down near the Massachusetts border. So you guys in Massachusetts might have the occasional Canada lynx that swings by, but let's just watch that one more time. And as the lynx goes by the screen, just watch how big those feet are, especially those back feet. They've got those giant snowshoe feet that are just perfect for running on top of the snow. There he goes. All right, and let's move into springtime. And this is the time where, at least for me, this is where when the blossoms come out and the trees start budding, everything starts to feel right again with the world. We all get a little bit less shut in, especially that feeling that we're all feeling right now, a little bit shut in. But I'm sure down in Connecticut and Rhode Island, you guys have had these for quite some time. My crabapple tree outside is just starting to blossom, and we're just starting to get a few of these first late spring surprises here in Vermont. So the eggs are going to start to hatch. The cycle of life is really starting anew this time of year. And one of the things that I love just thinking about is that all of this is going on completely oblivious to what's going on in the human world right now, right? That this cycle of life is just going to continue no matter what. There's a big group of wood frogs. So that's wood frogs, some of the earliest frogs that are going to come out and start making their noises this time of year. And then as you get into this I filmed just earlier this year. As you start getting a little bit later into the spring, you'll start hearing a lot of these through the early summer, which are the gray tree frogs. So anytime you're kind of anywhere near a wetland or on like a wet, rainy, late spring, early summer night, you're going to hear these guys. shortly, actually, in a lot of places in New England, this has probably already happened, is that some of the anadromous fish, some of the fish that will swim upstream that migrate annually in a cycle are going to start moving. And so this is taken in Willoughby Falls up in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, but these are steelhead rainbow trout, and they jump up Willoughby Falls every year to go spawn upstream. It's really kind of cool to see this, and it's actually a big wildlife watching opportunity. People all here in Vermont wait on the rocks and wait for these fish to jump up. It's really beautiful to watch them, and the falls that they jump up is protected from fishing. So, and just like that trout, you're going to find species like this trout lily. So this it has that speckled leaves on the side that look like a trout, but some of these spring ephemeral flowers start poking up through the forest duff. Something like this painted trillium as well. There's a really interesting study that came out of Massachusetts recently from Boston University, where they looked at Thoreau's records from the 1850s, and he took very detailed records on when everything was happening in nature and compared them to what's happening now. And as a result of climate change, they're finding that the trees are starting to bud a couple weeks earlier, but actually the spring wildflowers are coming out only 1 week earlier. So there is some concern that at the time of year, these guys are supposed to be getting full sunlight. They're getting shaded out a little bit early. So people are keeping a really close eye on that in New England. So this idea of, this is the one that really inspires me. This idea of the wildness of New England. What is wilder than these guys, these peregrine falcons? They dive 230 miles an hour out of the sky, and they knock their prey unconscious. Their main prey, these are the fastest birds in the world, obviously the fastest ones in New England. Their main prey is the second fastest bird that we regularly see here, which is actually the pigeon. And this idea of wildness, you can see these nesting on the cliff sides of Maine or the mountains of New Hampshire, but you can also see them right in downtown Boston or Hartford. They bring the wildness right into all of us. And I think that's pretty amazing. I remember one time I was actually driving with my wife in southern New England, and we went under an underpass. We were doing 75 miles an hour on the highway, and a pigeon flew right in front of our car from the underpass with a peregrine falcon right on its tail. And I'm like freaking out as I'm driving. Oh my God, that was a peregrine falcon. And my wife's freaking out. Just keep your eyes on the road. So these guys are all around us. And you know, to me, they really are a symbol of that wildness. So there's that rusty bike wheel sound of the peregrine falcon. So some of the first birds to return to New England are some of these flycatchers, like this eastern phoebe. This is the one that if you have like a boathouse or something like that, oftentimes you'll see these phoebes nesting right on the side of a boathouse or like a garage or a shed or something like that. The flycatchers will actually catch insects right out of the air, and I haven't ever figured out exactly what this guy has. I think that's a dragonfly in his mouth. I just took this photo a couple weeks ago, and I was out looking for birds. There's that classic beep beep sound. And to me, spring is just synonymous with warblers. This is the time of year I get so excited because you can get out and see some of these warblers, like this common yellowthroat, one of the warblers that shows up this time of year, and you see it has that amazing, you know, some people call it the bandit bird. It's got that little mask right over its eyes. It looks like a bandit. It's got this witchetty witchetty sound it makes. Another really neat warbler are these yellow warblers. Yellow is actually the most common color of warblers in New England. And a lot of that is because of the fact that when the leaves start to come out, they are actually pretty yellowish before they get green. And these guys can blend relatively well with a lot of the early spring leaves as they're just starting to come out. There's just so much yellow in them. One of the neat things is a lot of the warblers are insect eaters. They're bouncing around on the trees eating insects. But this time of year, in the springtime, birds that you typically think of as being fruit eaters or seed eaters, a lot of them will start targeting insects because they're so high in the protein content and they want to use them to feed their babies. And this bird has a sweet, 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 I'm so sweet sound. Let's hear that. There it is. And another little warbler here, the yellow-rumped warbler. In this photo, you can just see a little bit of that yellow rump, although most of the time when they're perching, their wings are covering that part up. 95% of the time you see these, their wings are folded over their rumps there, and so it's hard to see it. This used to be actually two different species, both the Audubons and the myrtle, and they were most recently combined into one species, and both of those are considered subspecies. But let's hear these guys. Kind of I find their call a little bit hard to pick out. It's a little indiscriminate. And then every year I get some of these that nest right down the hill from my driveway and the little stream that we have across our property. This is a chestnut-sided warbler, and you can see that it's got this actual what's called a badge, the chestnut portion of it, right on the side of it. One of the neat things about this is these birds actually, that badge is a signal, just like a moose has big antlers. The most dominant moose has the biggest antlers that you can see. And these birds, the most dominant individuals, are going to have the biggest badge of that chestnut side going right along the edge of their bodies there. And you find these most dominant individuals in the highest quality habitat. So the best places for a chestnut-sided warbler. This is one where the mnemonic, I teach my two daughters, Nora and Claire, I say, this bird says, Nora and Claire are sweeties. Let's see if you can hear it. And then the last spring bird, I love this one. This is a bird that looks like you'd see it in a tropical rainforest, but this is actually a pretty common warbler in the forests of New England. This is a black-throated green warbler. And people would say, why don't they call it a black-throated yellow warbler? Well, you can't use yellow in every name of every warbler, even though most of them have a little yellow in it. So it's on the back side of it, it's a little bit greenish, it's a little bit of a stretch, but this is just a beautiful bird. One of my favorite sounds of summertime. I was actually birding in Cuba last spring, and was there with a guide, and the guide was showing me just incredible birds in Cuba that you can find nowhere else in the world. Some of them exist only in Cuba, and I was getting so excited about it. And then all of a sudden he got so excited about this one bird that he found, and he brought us over and he pointed at it, and it was this bird, the black-throated green warbler. And the funny thing is, this is a very common New England bird, but they only pass through Cuba about a week a year, and it's very rare. It's very unusual for him to see this, so it was kind of a funny exchange. That za-za-zee-zoo-zee, kind of a neat sound. So in the next slide, there's going to be a few birds we're going to hear. We're going to hear a wood thrush and a black-throated green warbler, this one, and then also an ovenbird. And I love this next slide. I could just stare at this all day, but this is where I'm going to take us into the summertime at a stream with some of the birds that you might hear in the forest canopy in the summertime. So let's hear all these. Love that. That to me, that one slide just speaks to that power of how nature makes us feel, and it's just amazing. So summertime, it's the time of year you can finally get out and explore some of these wild places in New England, right? Really get out there, get on the water, go for a paddle. Some of the things you might see, like this carnivorous pitcher plant. This is a species of plant that actually eats insects, traps them right in the bottom part of the folded up leaves there that have a little trap for the insects to get in because it needs nitrogen. It doesn't get nitrogen from the soil in the places that it grows, and so it needs that element. This is the time of year you're going to see a lot of the young mammals starting to come out, like this little raccoon, oftentimes mothers with the babies trailing behind them, some of the older adults. You might see this gray fox. We have two species of foxes here in New England, the red fox and the gray fox, and this is one that you're going to see a lot less. Red foxes are pretty common to see. One of the reasons for that is because this fox is the only member of the canid family, the only member of the dog family in the world that actually spends most of its time up in trees. They do that to escape predators. They find food like squirrels or things like that, chipmunks, and they'll actually even den right in the cavities of a tree. So kind of a cool adaptation for a mammal that most people don't think about as being a tree-dwelling species. You might stumble this time of year in the summertime onto a young fawn. In 3-4 weeks, the does are going to start dropping the fawns. And what they actually do is they'll leave them in one spot. The fawns lay motionless. They've got those nice spots on them. The fawns are actually adapted to have very little scent, and it's really hard for predators to find these. And so while in those first 2 or 3 weeks, while they're growing up bigger and nursing twice a day, the mother will come back and nurse them. She otherwise just leaves them alone so that predators can't find them. It is kind of a survival strategy for them. So if you're ever walking in a field in the summertime and you come upon one of these, sometimes people get upset or worried that it's abandoned, that it's an orphaned fawn. but it's just good to know that it's not, that it's actually the mother's around. She's probably watching you from where you are, and just leave it be. Just enjoy it from a distance and move on. And the mother is definitely somewhere around. This is the time of year that we start seeing some of the turtles looking for places to nest. Oftentimes, like this big snapping turtle are going to be nesting on the sandy banks on a road, but really what they're looking for is the sandy bank of a river. That's kind of their primary habitat for this, but sometimes they confuse the edge of a road, which has that same consistency of sand, as a place to nest. Or something like this little spiny soft-shell turtle. We have these here in Lake Champlain, just tiny little guys, but they can grow right up and big. Just to show you how small they are when they first grow, that's it. I mean, that's, you know, someone's hand, and it really is only going about 1 knuckle's width. The main problem for these guys when they're so little is actually they're oftentimes eaten by fish. They've got a little soft shell. This is a species that's really starting to recover in our region thanks to a lot of concerted conservation efforts. But I just thought I'd throw in this photo here. This is actually at a wedding in Florida. My wife took this photo, and I found this. We were outside at this wedding, and this spiny softshell turtle was just about to cross a road. And so I went over and picked it up and moved it to the other side of the road where it was going, with my wife kind of saying like, oh, don't let it pee on you, don't get dirty for this wedding. But this is how big that they can get. And hopefully in New England, we're going to start seeing some that are starting to get this big, since the recovery for these really started about 20 years ago. So I think we are going to start seeing some really nice big spiny softshell turtles in this region. Summertime is that time of year, of course, when all the flowers come out. These are cultivated lupines actually, but they're also wild lupines in New England as well. Not a very common species, oftentimes listed on a state's rare, threatened, and endangered species list. But any one of these species, cultivated and wildflowers, are all going to benefit the pollinators and all of the insects that use them, like this bumblebee here. And then those insects in turn are going to benefit some of the things that eat them, like the birds and the bats. So this is a research study where they were, as you can see, banding bats. This is a bat that had previously been banded. You know, I think we should all feel a special closeness to bats right now. They actually had their own global pandemic about 10 years ago with white nose syndrome, 12 years ago now. And they didn't practice social distancing, and they passed it to each other. And one of the issues actually that people have, I just read earlier this week with COVID, is people are really concerned that humans might pass this virus back to bats. So for example, if people are caving and they actually have COVID, there's some concern that they might give it to bats here in North America. And so there's been a lot of information out there telling people, don't go caving, keep your distance from bats. Bats don't need any more things hitting them right now. The nice thing about bats is they've started to stabilize, their populations are starting to level off, and there's some signs of hope for them. So some of the birds of summer. Let's start with this bignell thrush. I love the calls of the thrushes, the songs of the thrushes in the summertime. Let's hear this one first. Very complex sound there. I don't know if anybody heard another bird song in the background there. We're going to talk about that other bird next. But this is the type of place you find that bignell thrush. So on the top of a mountain. This is on the top of Mount Mansfield, but this is a bird that will nest anywhere in the highlands of Vermont, western Massachusetts, New Hampshire, northern central Maine, all the way up through eastern Canada. This is the type of bird that you'd find there. There is some concern that as this nesting area is smaller, the type of habitat that they're looking for on these mountaintops is these spruce fir forests. There's some concern that climate change is going to make these spruce fir forests a little bit smaller on the tops of mountains. So people are keeping a really close eye on that. But the bird for any of you avid birders that you heard in the background there was this one. Another bird you might hear on the mountaintops of New England or right in my backyard is this white-throated sparrow. I've been hearing a lot of these this year. So this is a bird that has this really neat call. Some people say, poor Sam, Peabody, 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 or oh my Canada, Canada, Canada. So let's hear that one. This one has a slight variation where it goes lower at the end. And then this is another one. As we're moving down into the valleys, another thrush that you might hear. This is one of my favorite bird songs to hear. I was birding about 2 weeks ago when I took this picture, and it was the first hermit thrush that I'd heard for the summer. And oh my God, it was like waves of euphoria just hit me to hear this bird. It was just so lovely. This is the state bird up here in Vermont. And it's just such a wonderful song. It's just the epitome of a warm summer day to me. It has that just incredible two-tone sound. They've actually slowed some of these thrushes down and found that they're making two notes in parallel with each other, which is pretty amazing that they're able to do that with one set of vocal cords. And then some of the less noisy, less showy ones, but the ones that are still there, like this long-eared owl. This is a bird that some people sometimes confuse this with a great horned owl, but they look a little bit different. To me, the difference is that these guys really look surprised, whereas great horned owls look mad. So if you look at their facial expressions, they both have those tufts that are actually not their ears. Those are just feathers. Their ears are actually back behind their eyes there. But yeah, this is a long-eared owl, and we do have these here in New England. Let's hear what they sound like. Not the most exciting, right? A little less showy than some of the thrushes and warblers. Another bird you're going to see flying around in the summertime is this tree swallow, which is going to be, you're going to see this in huge flocks swirling all over the water, catching insects out of the air. Let's hear what those sound like. Another bird seen around the water is this osprey. This is a bird that's really had an incredible recovery thanks to a lot of effort from conservationists in the past half century. They've, 40 or 50 years, they've really come back around to the point where sometimes, they're getting in people's ways, which is kind of, nesting in a spot like on a lighthouse or things like that, where they have to be moved. And isn't that kind of the goal for every species that's really rare now, is getting it to the point where it's so common that sometimes it's not necessarily in the right spot. But this is a bird that flies out of the air and catches fish right out of the air, kind of like an eagle. There's that little poppy sound from that. And then I think our last bird of the summer is this song sparrow. This is a really common bird that you're going to hear all over the place. They're really nothing to look at. They're the epitome of the little brown bird, but boy, they have this beautiful, incredible song. All right, I was wrong. There was one more bird that I think I put in this one, because this is a bird that we do not have here in Vermont, nor in any of the other New England states except of Connecticut. This is a bird that's found mostly in the mid-Atlantic states along the coast. It's a yellow-crowned night heron. The rest of us in New England have black-crowned night herons, which are similar to these, but only Connecticut's lucky to have these on the coast. And let's hear this little grunt of a sound that these guys make. They're incredibly beautiful birds to look at, but not so much for their song. And we finished with the quintessential bird of summertime, is the common loon. So these are loons actually nest or overwinter on the coast of New England, and then they come into mainland New England to breed. And one of the conservation challenges with these is that you can see that they're, I'm trying to point as if you guys could see me pointing, but all the way on the very back of their body are their legs, which means that they can't walk on land at all. Loons spend their entire lives on the water, except for when they're nesting. And when they nest, they have to nest within just a few feet of the edge of the water. So they're very susceptible to disturbance from things like motorboats or kayakers or canoers, which is why we go out and we actually put these, as an intern of mine a couple of summers ago, go out and put these signs up to make sure that people stay away from them. Unfortunately, the loons don't always get the memo that they're supposed to stay inside the signs. So here's the tremolo. Here, let me back it up actually. So loons actually have 4 different sounds that are all kind of unique and interesting. The first one is this tremolo. And that's just to announce its presence on the lake. And that's a little hoot. That's just the short calls that they make to keep in contact with each other. So the hoot is kind of the everything is cool sound. This one is the everything is not cool sound. That's the male's yodel. That's his territorial claim. So that's the location of a mating pair. They wail back and forth, and that's often compared to the sound of a pack of wolves howling. So along with peregrine falcons, in contention for the wildness of New England might be these timber rattlesnakes. So a lot of people don't know that we even have rattlesnakes here in the wild in New England. They're a native species to all of the states of New England. Currently, they're not listed as being existent in Maine and Rhode Island, but they are. There are populations in Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire. And New England, or I'm sorry, and here in Vermont, actually, all of the denning sites, all of the known locations for timber rattlesnakes are actually protected by the Nature Conservancy. We own the land where these all are, and we generally keep people away from them. But I've actually spent a lot of time in here, in around them, in their den sites, and they're very docile. We're actually working with some state wildlife biologists on the conservation of them. Here's a buddy of mine, Doug Blodgett, checking one for a disease that these animals sometimes get called snake fungal disease. And then let's round it out here real quick, and then we can get to questions with my other favorite time of year, autumn. This is the time of year that everybody swirls to kind of the rural areas of our region to look at the beautiful leaves. One of my favorite places in New England, one of the wildest places in my home state, is here at Green River Reservoir. This is a place that was conserved by the Nature Conservancy. And TNC actually passes on, at least here in Vermont, and I know in the other states we do, passes on a lot of their land for public conservation. So things like state forests, state parks, national wildlife refuges. And this is a place that I like to go actually between my home and my office in the morning and go for a quick morning paddle. Just absolutely beautiful here. And again, speaks to that wildness. This is only about a 10-minute drive from like a busy intersection with a mobile station and a CVS pharmacy. And then you can get out into something as extraordinarily beautiful as this in a short drive. You might find in the northern parts of New England, you might find one of these guys as you're out there, right? A moose, and you know, people love finding out what's going on with these guys these days. There's a lot of conservation challenges. Autumn is the time of year you get a lot of waterfowl migrating through. Waterfowl are great because they're one of the only groups of birds that have really increased over the past period of time. A lot of birds, when they survey them, grassland birds, woodland birds, everything like that, the sad truth is that they're decreasing, but these guys are on the rise. And the reason for that is because we have invested time and money in places like this, in the conservation of wetlands. And to me, all of the waterfowl demonstrate that we can do it. When we put money and conservation effort into a group of species, they improve, they get better. Mergansers that I found early this spring, these are kind of a neat bird. They're pretty much silent, but they actually nest in tree cavities and they have completely round spherical eggs. But as a result of our conservation efforts, we get to see geese flying overhead each fall. And to me, if loons are the quintessential sound of summer in New England, these geese flying over is the sound of fall. An animal you see busily preparing for winter in the autumn are these beavers. Beavers are just incredible, and I think we're just really starting to learn how important they are for conservation, the habitat that they create, the fact that they help create wetlands. They filter our water with those things. They're just an incredible species. If one species is going to save the world, other than those of us working in conservation, humans trying to save the natural world, it's going to be beavers. You know, it's estimated that before European colonization, there was about 300 million beavers across the North American continent, and up to 200 dams per square mile in some parts of New England. So think about how different our landscape must have been. It was just forested wetlands thanks to these beavers. And there's the beaver sound. So with that, we conclude our seasons of New England. And I just want to finish real quick with coming back to the loon, because, you know, the peregrine falcons, the timber rattlesnakes, that symbol of wildness. But to me, loons are the symbol of the peace that nature can bring. So there's really no sound, in my opinion, that can match that incredible call of a loon on a New England pond on a summer night. So I just wanted to go out by playing that one more time. Absolutely haunting. I just love it. So just when you're feeling down about what's going on in the world right now, I always try to remember that nature's going to go on, that they're going to be undaunted by the changes in the economy or the latest news headlines, that this summer loons are going to be nesting and making those same beautiful calls this summer. And I always include in my last slide pictures of my inspiration for why all this matters, why we do all this, why this wildness matters, right? Because I know, of course, that I and my colleagues are never going to grow wealthy working in conservation. It's not a money-making endeavor. But so I'm not going to be able to leave my children material wealth, but the absolute best that I can do, I feel, is to leave them that wildness that we all get to enjoy right now. And I think we can all work together to try to leave our children and our grandchildren that same wildness of New England that we all know and love. And so with that, James, I'm happy to take any questions that people have. You're muted, James.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you so much. What a wonderful way to close the presentation. Got a lot of comments about the fabulous photos and the recordings, and I concur. I learned a lot, and I also do want to let you know that telling me that the bears, the little cubs are, that they'll scratch you and they smell bad does not dissuade me from wanting to cuddle one of them. So that just so you know. So yeah, a lot of questions coming in. I would jump right to them. And one, just picking up on the conversation about bats. The white nose epidemic, has it gone away at least? What's happening with that right
now? So in 2008, that was the first time that white nose syndrome was found in North America. It had probably been there for a little bit. They thought it's a fungus, it's a fungal disease of bats, and it was brought over from caves in Eastern Europe, probably by cavers on their boots. It's a fungus that bats in Eastern Europe had grown used to, they'd evolved with over probably a very long period of time. But like most kind of invasive species or introduced species, this fungus hit bats very hard. They found that there were 90% decreases year after year. So a giant cave, one protected by the Nature Conservancy, they would do a bat survey and estimate 10,000 one year, and then 1,000 the next year, and then 100 the next year, and then 10 the next year. So it was a 90% declines every year. It was precipitous fall. Now, in the last few years, they've found that some of the bat species that were hit hardest with this, like little brown bat, are starting to level off a little bit. They're finding that, probably the bats that were most resistant to this fungal disease are the ones that have survived. And even though bats reproduce very slowly, they only have one pup a year generally, they are starting to at least stabilize, which is a really good sign. Assuming that these bats are resistant, they'll probably come back, but it's going to take a long time because of their slow reproductive rate. So, a really difficult situation, but I think we're in a good place at least with them right now.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Tom. So, the questions we have range from some that are really quite specific and some that are broader in topic. A couple of the specific ones we'll jump in. The difference between a warbler and a goldfinch. How can you tell?
Oh, that's a really good question. So goldfinches look like a lot of the warblers, and sometimes it takes a few seconds. Goldfinches have that kind of dark black bands on their upper back and the tops of their wings, and none of the other warblers that I can think of really have that. But a lot of, warblers are a group of species that are categorized kind of like you would, shorebirds or thrushes or some of the other bird groups. And it just takes a little bit of time and practice of looking at them over and over again, and especially hearing their songs. Most of the time, in 2 or 3 weeks when the leaves all come out, most of us that like to go out birding are going to be doing it mostly by ear because it gets harder to see the birds as the leaves all come out. And so it just takes a lot of practice. There's actually an app that I use on my phone. I'm kind of a bird nerd, and I love practicing over the wintertime. It's called Chirp USA, and it allows you to do little 10-question quizzes of all the different bird songs. It's a good way that I've found to learn the bird songs in the off season so that I can really nail them when they come back this time of year.
That's awesome, Tom. And you anticipated one of the questions, which was, are there any apps or websites you would recommend to identify bird songs?
Yeah.
And you may have others, and we can also include those in the follow-up that we send after the webinar.
Perfect.
Are there others you would want to
So
mention?
the only other one that I would mention, Chirp is a lot of fun. It's like playing games, but when I'm actually out there, I use the Merlin Bird ID, which is the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's app. It is absolutely fantastic. Recommend it to have every birder have that on their phone.
Great, great. That's really helpful. So the first picture in the program, do you know which photo that is and where it was taken?
The first picture in the program, as in the, I'm assuming it's the bear, like the one on the opening slide?
Maybe, or I think there was also a landscape. We can also figure that out after the fact. If
that mess things up? Here, let me go see. So this one, oh, that was taken up on the Clyde River in the Northeast Kingdom. So it's just a beautiful wild place in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. And it's a place that the state of Vermont and a few conservation partners like TNC and Vermont Land Trust are working in pieces to actually conserve that landscape. So that's why I included that, because it's a conservation project.
Great, great. You know, you mentioned earlier that a lot of these presentations had dug deep on, you know, some fairly technical topics, but I have to say I found this presentation also quite informative. So really appreciate that. Question, in your opinion, what are the prospects for the cougar to recolonize New England?
Boy, that's a great question. That's a lot of fun to think about. So cougars' habitat is generally anywhere where there's forest cover. So if you look in the Western United States at the places that they have cougars, it's where they have intact forests. If you look at a map of forest cover in North America, Eastern North America, so the Appalachian region up through New England, we have tremendous forest cover, and cougars, mountain lions, catamounts, whatever you want to call them, pumas, all the same species, are native to this part of the country. So really, they can and would do fine here because we do have the forest cover for it, and we have the habitat, or I mean, we have the prey base for it. They can eat things like deer, and moose, you know, are going to be a big prey item for them. So it's really just a matter of them getting here. There was one that died that was hit by a car in Connecticut about 10 years ago, I want to say, off the top of my head. And they thought it had immigrated through from South Dakota. And so it's just a matter of them kind of crossing that big empty space without forest cover in kind of the Midwest and Plains states and getting here and recolonizing.
I remember this story that you're mentioning.
Yeah.
The gray tree frog, is it the same thing as a spring peeper?
No, that's a great question. And their songs, when you don't play them against each other, like not back to back, they sound kind of similar in my head, I always do. But the peeper is a different species of frog. They're going to be one of the first ones, along with the wood frogs, those ones that I played from the little video. They're going to be one of the first ones that come out. So, you know, even up here in the mountains in Vermont, you know, mid-March, late March, if we get kind of a warmer night in the 40s and some rain, you're going to be hearing those. Whereas gray tree frogs come out a little bit later. One of the neat things about gray tree frogs is they can actually, kind of like a chameleon, they can change their color just a little bit from gray to greenish based on what they're on. So,
yeah, I was really struck by that image. It's really interesting looking frog. Now, yeah. I apologize in advance if I mispronounce the name in the next question.
Sure.
This is from Caliandra, age 10. How do you take pictures? Great question, by the way. How do you take pictures of these wild animals without frightening them and while also keeping yourself safe?
That's a good question. So, you know, the birds, you know, this time of year, they're very curious. They'll come down and take a look at you. You know, some of probably the only ones that, so the rattlesnakes, generally we recommend that people who are not conservation professionals tend to give rattlesnakes a little bit more space. And the times that I was visiting the rattlesnakes dens, I was doing it with folks at TNC and state wildlife biologists, and we were using chaps. We try to keep the locations of those dens not secret per se, but we try to keep them a little bit less known because we don't want people going in there collecting them or harming them or anything like that. But one of the neat things about those rattlesnakes is that common to in opposition to what a lot of people would think about them, they're actually very docile. I had a couple of rattlesnakes that, one that would just kind of crawl right below my legs, no problem for me at all. The state wildlife biologist that I was working with has been doing that for decades and has never had any problems around them. But he's well trained to handle them or to be around them. So again, the public, generally, we don't want that. There was one rattlesnake actually that we had a pit tag in that we took the pit tag out, which is basically like a radio collar for a snake. You actually insert it surgically right inside their skin. And we wanted to figure out where they were going to see if they were migrating between some of these conserved lands. And after the pit tag was removed at the end of the study, we had to take the rattlesnake back out in the wild and actually hiked up one of the mountains that we have conserved with the Nature Conservancy with the rattlesnake strapped to my backpack in a little bucket. An enormous big yellow rattlesnake, and got to let it out into the wild, which was just one of the craziest days at work I've ever had.
That's a good story.
Yeah.
I have not had that opportunity in my position yet. Question is, are ticks an issue for black bears as they are for moose?
Yeah, that's a great question. So ticks are really, the ticks that are bothering moose are called winter ticks. They're a totally different species of tick than the ticks that bother us, which are black-legged ticks or deer ticks, the same thing, just two different names. The ones that give us Lyme disease are those black-legged ticks, whereas the winter ticks that bother moose, moose are their primary host here in New England. They'll actually gather on moose in some of the core habitat of moose in Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire. They've found, tens of thousands of ticks on a single moose, to the point where it does kill them. It's really a conservation issue for moose. The problem with moose is that they did not co-evolve with these ticks. They did not evolve alongside of them. And so moose don't groom themselves as regularly as some of the other species of large mammals in the area. So bears and deer especially. Deer groom themselves all the time. And so as a result of that, they can get rid of those ticks before they become a problem. Same thing with bear. Bear are a little bit better at grooming. They're more regular at it. So they'll get rid of the ticks before the ticks reproduce in number and really explode on them and become a problem. Whereas moose do not do that. They're what's called a stimulus groomer, meaning that they only groom when they feel something that's irritating them. And by that point for a moose, if they have winter ticks on them, it's already too late.
Loons, awesome calls, by the way. Do loons mate for life?
That's a good question. I think that in general they do, but I don't think that it is set. I think that the same pair will come back. I seem to recall the same pair will come back probably a few times, but then something might happen and they might mix it up and another one will kind of exchange. Maybe one of the pair dies or maybe one of them kind of moves on. And so I think that from what I recall, I'm not 100% certain of this, that they are more committed than some birds, but like not like swans or some of the classic ones that it's like one pair and that's it for you for life. Yeah.
This is a question that I love, which is, can you please describe a bear's den?
Yeah. So people always think the classic bear den that everybody kind of thinks about is a cave. I've been to a lot of bear dens in my life, and some of the wildlife biologists that I work with that do that exclusively have been to probably hundreds, and they really vary quite tremendously. I would say the classic bear den is a really big old maple or oak tree that has died and that is still standing upright. You know those ones sometimes you'll go find like on an old fence row, you'll find those ones where it's, maybe 30 feet up, it's just broken off and it's just rotting, but it's still standing up. So what they'll do is they'll actually excavate right under the root ball underneath that. And then they've got basically a really nice big roof all around them. Oftentimes they'll actually break off branches of evergreen trees like white pine and things like that and line the bottom of it almost like a nest. So that's, I would say, the most common one. Sometimes if there's like a blowdown of a bunch of trees that all kind of blew on the same thing, create a little bit of a natural roof that way, a bear will do that. But there's a lot of variety. Sometimes it's in a little cave, a jumble of rocks, and they'll find a way to nestle in under there. And then the funny part is sometimes they'll actually den up in a tree off the ground. So you can find bears that are denning, especially a mother with cubs. She might very well den 20 feet off the ground in a hollow up in a tree, which is kind of an unusual place. And I know that when the teams are working with the radio collared bears, that's like their nightmare because they can't get up there, they can't get in there to check the collar. So it's a nightmare only in terms of logistic. It's just really hard to deal with that bear as opposed to one that's on the ground.
Is the lynx population stable, growing, or in decline? And is TNC involved in taking actions to help them?
Yeah, so lynx had a really interesting cycle in New England. There was the spruce budworm epidemic that hit Maine, which is the core of lynx habitat in New England. Historically, there were very few records of lynx before the year 2000 in Vermont, and I'm sure that the numbers were also very low in New Hampshire because it's really not the core of their habitat. They need like vast expanses of evergreen forests with a lot of snowshoe hares, which is their primary prey. So when the spruce budworm epidemic hit Maine, there was tremendous amount of harvest that happened with all of those trees, which meant that there was a huge number of young trees growing up. And that meant that as a result, there were a huge number of snowshoe hares and a giant boom of lynx. And so that happened in the late 20th century. As a result of that, some of the lynx kind of got pushed out to some of the outlying regions like Vermont or New Hampshire, and they started being spotted in places that they weren't really seen before. We started getting records here in Vermont of lynx, actually a few small breeding families of lynx about 10 or 15 years ago here in Vermont. And then recently, we really haven't seen that many at all. And so it's a matter of that explosion of snowshoe hares as a result of all that timber harvest, creating ideal conditions. The explosion of snowshoe hares caused the explosion of lynx, which caused them to spread out. But then once that kind of settled down, they probably contracted back into the core of their habitat in central Maine.
Okay. Thank you, Tom. And thanks, everyone. We've gotten a lot of great questions, and we are getting close to the end of our time, so we know we won't get to them all, and I apologize in advance for that. Tom, changes that you expect to see in bird species as the climate warms?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're already seeing some new species coming into the region. We had our first sighting here in Vermont of black vultures a few years ago. Oh, there's another one that I'm trying to think of off the top of my head. I know we're starting to see some birds that we really haven't been seeing before, other than just accidentals. But I think that one of the things that we're really worried about actually are some of the birds that might move out of New England and start moving farther north. And one of the ones that I mentioned, that big-nosed thrush that really only nests on the high ridge lines of New England, that habitat might start to change pretty rapidly over the next century or two, and you might see those starting to migrate out of the state. But yeah, it's a good question. I'm sure that we will start to get some of the more southern neighbors that are moving up here to us. Yeah, so we'll see.
So I think this will be the last one, and recognizing that we only have technically a couple of minutes up until 1, it's a big question, but it might be a nice thing to kind of close on. And then
Sure.
It has to do with, one or two of the main wildlife issues or challenges in the region, and how is TNC working to help with those?
The biggest thing that wildlife are struggling with is maintaining healthy and connected habitat. That's the direction that wildlife conservation has gone in the past, in recent decades. And that's the thing that TNC has really emerged as a leader in, is just that idea of species need a place to live and they need to be able to travel from one to the other. And so what we're really doing is maintaining that matrix across the landscape. And one of the neat things is we're working, regionally and even kind of nationally and internationally with Canada. We're maintaining these large connected corridors so that wildlife can get to the things that they need as they become increasingly pressured and stressed from things like climate change.
Yeah. Tom, thank you so much. Great last question and a lovely presentation. I suspect I'm not alone in feeling like, I want to see these things. So look forward to being able to do it in person again. But the photos were fabulous, and as were all of the audio recordings. Really took us on a journey. So everyone, thanks so much for being here again today for Nature Connects. We had a great turnout for today's webinar, and we really value, at TNC, we really value having the opportunity to to spend time with you. And we will follow up after the webinar. It'll take a few days, but we'll send an email and we'll include follow up on a couple of the apps that Tom mentioned, maybe some other items that came up in the conversation. Please come back and join us again for Nature Connects. You can find information about the webinar series on nature.org/mass. You can check out both Vermont program, the Massachusetts program. All the New England programs have their own pages on nature.org, social media accounts that you can get a lot of cool information and see some great images. So Tom, thank you again. And everyone, we hope to see you for the next Nature Connects. And with that, I think we can we'll sign off for today.
Thanks very much, James. Thanks everybody. Take care.
Bye.